The Supermarine Spitfire is the most recognizable fighter aircraft from World War II. It was a fearsome weapon of war. The Spitfire's speed, agility and firepower, combined with the skill and bravery of the pilots that flew it, made it a true flying legend and an icon that helped turn the tide in the early years of World War II. The Spitfire was born out of a series of monoplane air racing aircraft designed by Supermarine in the 1930s. The series of seaplanes won the famous Schneider Trophy air race 3 times, a triumph for Supermarine chief designer R.J. Mitchell. He believed that single-wing monoplane designs were the future, whilst other designers still believed in the 2-wing biplane. In fact, the monoplanes he designed were almost 200 miles per hour faster than the RAF's frontline fighters of the time. With the clouds of war looming over Europe, the Air Ministry decided that they needed new fighters to cope with the latest designs coming out of the Third Reich in Germany. Supermarine had privately funded a new design they called the Type 300. It used a new engine from Rolls-Royce called the PV-12. This had a power output of about 1,000 horsepower, much more than other engines at the time. The engine was later christened the Merlin. The Type 300 first took to the skies on the 6th of March 1936. The aircraft was later christened Spitfire by Supermarine, and a legend was born. Alex Henshaw was one of the test pilots at Supermarine.
When I first flew it at low speed, I thought what a remarkably harmonized, controllable machine it was. But of course, it was something that hadn't been tested in any shape or form. And I think that it wasn't accepted, shall we put it that way, as a weapon of war. It might have been a delightful aircraft in the sky, might have looked lovely, might have handled very nicely, but there's an awful long way from being a delightful aircraft to fly and that to be a really vicious weapon of war.
However, the Air Ministry saw the enormous potential in Mitchell's design and placed an order for 310 aircraft in June 1936. But there was a lot of work to do.
There was a certain amount of apprehension because although the Spitfire was proving itself, it was somewhat difficult to fabricate and certainly very advanced in design for aircraft of that day. Most of us were apprehensive that we may not get another contract beyond, I think it was the first 300 that we were producing. Whereas of course in effect we went on to produce not 15 a week, but 320 a month at Castle Bromwich, to say nothing of what Supermarines and all the other satellite factories produced.
As production continued, Alex Henshaw was often asked to display the Spitfire in front of visiting VIPs.
Sir Alex Dunbar telephoned and said he'd like a display to be carried out over Birmingham. And I was about to say, well, you know, it's not a very good idea. In fact, it's dangerous. And I was beginning to interrupt when he said, oh no, he said, I've arranged this all with the Lord Mayor. And he said, you're to go. And I said, well, what height do you want? He said, well, over the Civic Centre. And I said, all right, sir. And so I took off with I think it was Mark II, and I climbed to start with the 5,000 feet. And then when I looked down, I could see if I had an engine failure, nowhere could I land over this place. And as I dived down, I got very, very angry And I thought, right, you want a display over the middle of Birmingham? You shall have a display over the middle of Birmingham. And of course I shot the place up, and of course I did a roll down New Street at only above the Civic Centre height, and of course it stopped all the traffic, and they thought the place was being bombed. There was hell to play. And of course when I got back to the airfield, I don't know how many police cars were there, at least half a dozen police cars. There was the Chief Constable, there was Lord Dudley, the High Commissioner for the Birmingham area, and God knows what. And of course the Chief Constable said, he said, I'm afraid you've got to come to the station and make a statement. I said, I'm not going anywhere. I said, I take my orders from the Managing Director, you better see him. And of course that was the last I heard of it.
Mitchell himself did not live to see his design successes. He lost a long fight against cancer in June 1937.
Mitchell was a remarkable designer, a genius in fact. But what is even more remarkable is the team that he gathered together that were able to continue with the fantastic work that he had already done with the Spitfire.
That work was continued by a team led by Joseph Smith. They refined Mitchell's design and saw it into full production. The very first Spitfires went into service with 19 Squadron at Duxford in August 1938. By now, the aircraft had a more powerful version of the Merlin engine, giving it a top speed of 362 miles per hour, and it could fly up to 32,000 feet. In September 1939, Germany launched a blitzkrieg attack on Poland, and as a result, Britain declared war on Germany. The Spitfire was held back from initial operations in Europe, as it was thought to be too important. However, squadrons were still placed on readiness for any potential attacks. John Milne was ground crew on Spitfires at Duxford.
Well, not a lot happened at first. There was no war on that you could see. Every morning we pushed the Spitfires out of what is now Hangar 4 onto the concrete, and every evening we pushed them back in again. And every morning you had your own Spitfire, which you gave a complete inspection of, called the daily inspection, which is to a set printed thing that you learned. You did all that, and then you cleaned it, made sure it was filled with oil and petrol, made sure that the hydraulic reservoir was full, that the air bottles were up to the right pressure, and then you waited. And eventually you got word that they were going to fly, whether in anger or just for practice, and the flight mechanic would get in the cockpit to start the engine, and then the pilot would come and get in and take off. When the air war really got going, which was at the time of Dunkirk, 19 Squadron covered the evacuation from Dunkirk, and it was quite a busy time then. You might have to send the Spitfires up at a few minutes' notice, but the pilots would run out and jump in, and before you knew what was going on, they'd all gone off. When they came back, you looked to see if the fabric which covered the gun ports had been breached, and you know that they'd been in action and fired the guns. And if they had, of course, the armourers had to reload the guns, which was done from underneath, and we, the riggers, had to get fresh squares of linen fabric and paste them over the gun ports. There was quite a good affinity between the ground crew and the pilots in those days. And they must have trusted us, because if we did something wrong, they'd crash.
As production ramped up, ferry pilots delivered Spitfires to squadrons around the country. Peter George's first experience with a Spitfire was memorable for the wrong reasons.
Well, sadly enough, I landed the bloody thing with the wheels up. Right. I was actually flying it in weather that probably I shouldn't have been flying, but the CO was pressing everybody to get deliveries. And so constantly against my better judgment, I flew the thing down to Kirkbride, and I never know to this day whether the wheels had actually stuck halfway, because I read somewhere after the war that if you didn't push the lever right through, went through 180 degrees, then it was possible to get the wheels stuck. But in any event, I knew things had gone wrong when the prop came off. Well, we had to shift aircraft from the factories to the maintenance units, to the squadrons, to the ports if they were going to be boxed up and put on aircraft carriers. We just had to move aircraft wherever they were wanted. I delivered 211 Spitfires and 11 Seafires. We went into and out of airfields that were eminently unsuitable for the speed of the aircraft. Now that was one of the interesting things, but I mean you got used to handling that. And the training that one had with the Air Transport Auxiliary was extremely good. But we had, all we had was ferry pilot's notes, which I've got here. Well, it's got all you need to know. You turned up the card for the particular aircraft, whether it happened to be a Spitfire, a Mustang, Avenger, whatever.
The Spitfire's benign handling characteristics were a major benefit for the young frontline pilots that were learning to fly them.
Successful World War II fighter has to be easy to fly because they just didn't have time to train.
It's extraordinary, the lack of operational training. I had about 6 hours on Spitfires before I went to a squadron. I'm just remarkably fortunate to live. But there's no time for us to have that training.
Well, we were really anxious. Being 19 at the time, we were anxious to get trained and get into it. The aircraft, the Spitfires that we had to fly at that time, were obviously the clapped out stuff that nobody else wanted, because so some of them were a little bit awkward to fly, but they were fine.
In the summer of 1940, Hitler began his attacks on the UK in preparation for a full-scale invasion. It started with attacks on shipping and naval targets in the English Channel. Soon, many Spitfire pilots were getting their first taste of aerial combat.
But you're calling on your aircraft to do far more than it was ever designed to do. And looking around, getting a sore neck looking around.
The first time we were flying as a squadron, and 109 came and was nipping round above us for a little while, and eventually decided he'd better do something, and he attacked the squadron head on. The CO had a quick burst at it. I was flying at the back, and as he came over, I followed him down and kept firing and watched him go in, and the CO and I split it and got half each.
Well, I think the first thing you've got to do is to know how to shoot. The second thing you've got to do is to realise that with your cannons you had got 12 seconds, with your machine guns you've got 14 seconds. So for God's sake, don't keep your finger on the button too long, because you'll be out of ammunition. And hopefully you get through those first 6 or 7 missions. I mean, we found that in our squadron we didn't have too many casualties, but it was the new boys who had only just joined who would perhaps go the wrong way.
It does go very fast. 1 minute there's aeroplanes everywhere, and the next you suddenly find yourself probably on your own. And if that happens, make for home, because you're a bit exposed on your own.
In August, the Luftwaffe started attacking RAF airfields with the intention of gaining dominance over the skies. Wave after wave of bombers attacked, and it was left to the Spitfire and Hurricane squadrons to defend the skies. The Hurricanes would attack the bombers, and the faster, more manoeuvrable Spitfires would go after the ME-109 escort fighters. The duels in the skies could be seen by people on the ground, who could see the white trails in the sky. Newspapers and newsreels both proclaimed the heroism of the RAF pilots and the power of the Spitfire. The aircraft itself quickly became a symbol of Britain's defiance against the odds, and was a big boost for morale amongst the general public. RAF squadrons were stretched to the limit.
Numbers I would not know. I do know we used to run short of aircrew. We'd get perhaps 5 new ones at the beginning of a week, and by Friday you'd perhaps have 2 left.
You weren't sort of full of foreboding or anything like that, nothing like that at all. Because you're cocky, you were flying a Spitfire and you were better than most other people. And, well, we'd beaten them before and we were going to beat them again.
But we used to wait for them to come back. And I can honestly say that after they'd left, you counted them in when they come back, and if one was missing, you never left the flights until he showed up, was dead, or it was in hospital or crashed somewhere else. You never left.
But as the long summer dragged on, the RAF kept up the pressure, and eventually Hitler's resolve weakened and the planned invasion was postponed. The Spitfires and Hurricanes had secured a victory that would change the outcome of the Second World War. The Spitfire's development continued at a fast pace, and the new Mark IX version was starting to enter service.
Well, the Mark IX came in at a very critical time. We were at a situation where all the Marks up to the Mark V had been competing adequately with the Messerschmitt 109s, but then the Messerschmitt 109s were being improved and had a better performance. But I think the thing that shook the pilots in combat at that time was the FW-190. It completely outclassed the earlier Marks of Spitfire. But in so doing, when the Mark IX was introduced with a 2-stage blower and with a very marked degree of improvement in the performance, both on the climb and in the maximum speed, the Germans got a shock because they thought they were attacking an aircraft they'd been able to handle with great ease and shoot down.
Me personally, I rate the Spitfire 9 the finest airplane I ever flew. The interesting thing was, when the 9 came out, it had a 2-stage, 2-speed blower. And as you climbed at 17,000 feet, it automatically cut in. And coming down at 17,000 feet, it automatically cut out, which was the sort of forerunner of the software on cars and aeroplanes today. It used to happen. You could, of course, had a switch. You could bring it in or out whenever you wanted, but automatically that would happen. And I think for sheer enjoyment of aerobatics and the power, the extra speed and so forth, it left a very lasting impression. Everyone who flew Spitfires always says the 9, mind you, I never flew a 20 or a 19, but to me that was the best ever aircraft I flew.
The next major development for the Spitfire was a new engine. This time it was the Rolls-Royce Griffon. This was a V12 supercharged design like the Merlin, but with 36 litres instead of 27. The larger engine required the nose of the Spitfire to be extended, but the extra power meant that the Spitfire now had a top speed of some 440 miles per hour and a dive speed of nearly 500. The clipped wings seen on these aircraft were a modification to improve the roll rate of the Spitfire. The Griffin's sound was much more aggressive than the perfect tones of the Merlin. The Spitfire saw service in many theatres, including the challenging conditions in the desert. This created problems for the aircraft.
The problems, I think, were dust and sand, obviously, which gets everywhere. We needed special air filters, of course, and I think we had problems with the cannons, which were 20 millimetre, and they were mainly drum-fed, and I think a lot of them were jamming. They were bombing the line. We called it the daily mail run, if you like. The Mitchells and Bostons used to come over in quite large formations, and they needed close cover and top cover.
Very hard to assume today, when you look at formations of aircraft flying off in twos or fours. I doubt whether an operational flight today would have more than 4 aircraft. We would probably have 4 squadrons, 48 aircraft flying in our escort to half a dozen bombers, and from a very, very difficult pitch, because we were landing on muddy. Anyone tells you that North Africa is a sunny area, just remember that from November, December to the end of February it can be very wet and very muddy, and people tipping up on their noses, not just in landings but in taxiing sometimes, and we had the order that 2 people should be sitting on the tail fin, on the tail elevators, to keep your balance of your Spitfire in right order.
The Spitfire was also used as a potent ground attack aircraft.
Commonest thing, a little thing, it was they sweep the roads from B Hatch to somewhere else to somewhere, and any motorised transport you saw was enemy. So you might find yourself attacking a convoy of 20 vehicles, who hurriedly vacated, and they ran away sideways while you strafed them and set them alight, hopefully. But at a place like B Hatch, where there was a German airstrip, I remember on one occasion there were 4 aircraft lined up and we set them on fire.
The Spitfire was an incredibly adaptable piece of design. As well as being a fighter, it also served in many other roles: high and low altitude interceptor, reconnaissance, fighter bomber, and 2-seat trainer. They were also flown from aircraft carriers with a Seafire version. It was a tribute to Mitchell's design that the aircraft was capable of being developed so far. In fact, there were some 24 marks of Spitfire created, and over 20,000 aircraft were produced. The final Mark 24 version was over 30% faster than the Spitfire prototype, had almost double the rate of climb, and 5 times the firepower. The final Griffon engine was more than double the power of the original Merlin. The last flight of a Spitfire in RAF service took place in June 1957. The Spitfire had served well and had created a legacy that would live to this day. Remarkably, the Royal Air Force still operates 5 Spitfires today, as part of the Battle of Britain Memorial Flight. Based at RAF Coningsby in Lincolnshire, the flight takes part in air shows across the UK and Europe, as well as performing at ceremonial events. In 2007, the Battle of Britain Memorial Flight were tasked with 945 individual appearances at a staggering 536 separate events. These included 99 air displays and 437 flypasts of various sizes, ranging from the Queen's 80th birthday flypast over London, through commemorative flypasts for veterans, to small village fetes. The flight's aircraft appeared in front of an estimated total audience of 6 million people, bringing the RAF's history to life and showing Mitchell's masterpiece to a whole new generation. But it's not just the Battle of Britain Memorial Flight that operates Spitfires today. Around the world, many airworthy Spitfires are kept and flown by collectors. Specialist restorers rebuild and restore different variants of the aircraft. Although many Spitfires require substantial refabrication, often many of the original aircraft parts are kept. When the Spitfire was first built, it was an engineering challenge to put together, and the same is still true today. There are still many Merlin and Griffon spares around today, and a whole industry has grown up to support these restorations. Spitfires are regularly brought back to life in hangars like this one at Duxford in Cambridge, and aircraft are regularly sold for 6- and 7-figure sums. Wealthy individuals around the world collect all types of World War II aircraft, but it's the Spitfire that takes most people's interest. Collectors like Peter Teichmann are fascinated by the type.
The Spitfire particularly, I think, has got the biggest mystique about it. It's like a fine vintage wine or a special classic car. It's what wealthy people want to own. And in years gone by, people would buy classic cars because anybody can drive a classic car. But very few people can afford to own and fly these aeroplanes. But what's happening these days is there is a clique of wealthy people who are not flyers, they're investors, and they're looking now at the Spitfire as an investment vehicle, as something which is appreciating in value. So a lot of Spitfires are now being restored and bought by non-flyers. Which is a shame, really, because they're not being seen. But I was driven by the desire to fly the aeroplane. I'm coming from it not from an investment point of view. I purely want to fly. Well, first of all, you have to be mad. That's the first constituent part of getting involved in warbirds, because it's a black hole into which you pour money. I mean, aviation in general is a black hole, but warbirds more so. I got into it basically because I'd been many years flying everyday aeroplanes of various types, and then I bought my first classic aeroplane, which was a Beech Staggerwing, and then I started on the airshow season and saw lots of guys flying, beautiful warbirds, Corsairs and Mustangs and Spitfires and Hurricanes and the like, and I thought, I want a bit of this. So I took the plunge in 2001 and bought Jumping Jack, the P-51 Mustang, and then once you're bitten, it's all over. I'm afraid it's downhill all the way. The Mark 11 is very special. I mean, I always wanted a high-back Merlin engine Spitfire with history, and I was incredibly fortunate to be able to buy her, because her history is she came out of manufacture in 1944. She was immediately allocated to a forward squadron in Belgium, which is where 16 Squadron were. From the period from October 44 through to the end of the war, she did about 45 missions for 16 Squadron in photographic reconnaissance over occupied Germany, basically. So over, she flew over Hamburg and Dresden and Berlin and Eindhoven and all of these places, and in areas in Belgium and Holland. So she was very active. She was chased by Me-262s and shot up, and basically had a very fine service history. And eventually then, at the end of the war, as many aircraft were mothballed, and in 1947 she was sold to the Dutch government for the princely sum of £25, as I remember, and then used in an instructional airframe. Then she spent a period outside the officers' mess there, and then into a museum, and basically at the end finished up in Dielen in Holland, where a well-known restorer discovered her, at which point she was restored and she took back to the air in 1991, flown by Mark Hanna. And then she spent a number of years at Old Flying Machine here at Duxford for about 7 years. Then she went up to a private collection in Breeton in Yorkshire, and I was very lucky to acquire her in 2004. And she's the only Mark 11 flying in the world out of 450 that were made, and she's incredibly original. I mean, everything in her is pretty much as she left the factory.
Modern-day Spitfire pilots often get a sense of what it was like to fly the aircraft in combat all those years ago.
Yeah, when you're flying over the countryside on a sunny day and you're down low and you're flying in a Spitfire, you know, you find yourself looking in the mirror looking for the hun in the sun. You know, it's a piece of history. You're aware of it all the time, and I'm constantly aware of my responsibility as a guardian of history. And I look at myself just as owning that aeroplane at a stage, because I'll pass it on at some stage to somebody else who'll hopefully carry the ball forward for many years to come. So yes, you get a sense of history all the time.
It's at air shows where most of these Spitfires end up being seen, like this one, the annual Flying Legends Air Show. The show takes place at the Spitfire's first operational home, Duxford, now part of the Imperial War Museum, and it features different marks of Spitfire coming together to perform breathtaking display sequences. Modern-day Spitfire pilot Charlie Brown explained what it's like to display this classic fighter.
It's a fantastic airplane to display. It's very, very safe. It's ever so easy to fly, but don't tell everybody that if they want their money back. But it's a bit of a tricky to take off and a bit more tricky to land, particularly in a sort of gusty wind. But it is absolutely fantastic.
In-cockpit minicams also give you a chance to sit inside the cockpit of a Spitfire during a dramatic display sequence.
What sort of manoeuvres do we fly during the display? Yes, we normally fly just simple coordinated loops, rolls, nothing too strenuous, nothing that's sort of aerobatic, going to win an aerobatic competition, that's for sure, because we're trying to make it smooth, trying to preserve the energy in the aeroplane, trying to preserve the aeroplanes, because it's not the G you pull, it's the way that you pull it, you know, nice and smooth, no hard corners, and just the aeroplane demands to be flown that way anyway.
For the next few minutes, just sit back and enjoy the wonderful sight and sound of 9 Spitfires in full flight. Many people have tried to sum up just what it is about the Spitfire that makes it such a classic.
There is no sound like a Merlin, is there? There is no sound like it anywhere in the world. It is just absolute music. I mean, the French refer to it as la musique, and they're absolutely right. I suppose I take a great delight in seeing people with 40 million quid jet fighters show up at air shows, and actually people want to look at a Spitfire. Funny old thing. It's, of course, a perfect looking piece of design. It's a perfect sounding piece of design. It fits the Jaguar advert, the old Jaguar advert, grey space pace. It's one of the few artefacts which actually lives up to its reputation, which is not to say it's faultless. It's got a lot of faults. But in general terms, I don't know anybody who's flown one who's been disappointed with it. And you could also, I guess, say that if you get your 6 numbers up, you can have one. You can't have an F-15, no matter how much money you got.
It is a beautiful airplane to fly. And remember, it was designed by Mitchell to be flown by 19-year-olds with a couple of hundred hours, with fresh wings, straight out of grass fields. So I found it a joy to fly, as everybody does. I mean, you can wax on for hours about the Spitfire, but it is very special.
I felt it was a very exciting plane to fly, a very stable plane at the same time. You really felt you were part of a team. So I enjoyed it very much.
Well, apart from the fact that it looks right, and if an aeroplane looks right, it is, of all the first-line fighters, it had the most gentle stall that you could possibly imagine. I mean, it was just superb to fly. I was lucky. I went right up to the Mark 22, and that was the Griffin Spitz. I always felt that the Merlin Spit was a sweeter aircraft than the Griffin. I mean, some people would agree, some didn't. It was just a question of how you found it personally. But I mean, they were just lovely aeroplanes to fly. And that's about it.
I know 9 out of 10 people say, well, of course, when you got to the Mark 21s and the Seafire 45, 46s, it was no longer a Spitfire. Well, that to a degree is true, but then what you have to bear in mind, we were fighting for our very existence, and what we were producing, or at least what Supermarines were designing and producing, was a weapon of war that would meet every contingency placed upon it.
The Spitfire was something new. The Hurricane was an adaptation of an old system, and the Spitfire was an entirely new aircraft, completely different from anything that had gone before. And it had class.
When I was here some years ago, sitting in the big hangar underneath a Spitfire, a dear old lady who was probably 20 years younger than me, she said, "I envy you the magic of flying a Spitfire." And I said, "Madam, you wouldn't envy the magic of the bullets round your ears." I mean, is it just a little bit too much romance now? It's a fighting machine, and a good fighting machine.